Hello, I'm Peter Landau, managing editor of Newsjunkie.net, and I have our publisher, Gordon Whiting, with me today. I wanted to talk to him about an article he recently put out in the ongoing Newspapers and Civilization column he writes on an Indian editorial that was striking in its originality and power. First, I wanted to ask you, Gordon, how did you come across Ramnath Goenka? And what was it about his story that made you feel it was worth telling to a modern audience?
Ramnath Goenka is a big figure in India, but not so well known in America or around the world. I knew about the Ramnath Goenka Journalism Awards, but just the name. And then a few years ago, we started to research the newspapers of India, and we came across the Indian Express and the New Indian Express and found that they were owned by the Goenka family of the Express Group, and began to learn about his role in establishing the modern press in India, his role as a freedom fighter, and his whole story, which is remarkable.
The image it stays with readers is that blank editorial column. Why do you think that silent act of resistance was more powerful than publishing an editorial condemning censorship?
Well, this was one of the most famous incident that's attached to his career history, was restricted by censorship rules in the aftermath of Indira Gandhi's 1975 declaration of the so-called emergency, which put strict rules on the press, jailed many journalists and political opponents, and was a state of martial law. Lasted more than a year and a half, at least. And so, being his own man, he wanted to say something. So what he did, he published the usual editorial in the next edition after this declaration of martial law, but it had nothing in it. It was a blank 2 columns. And it was probably the obvious move, because any editorial protest would have certainly run afoul of the censors and would either have been modified or changed, removed. So he published a blank column, and the courage was that he knew it would be taken antagonistically. So maybe the genius wasn't in publishing the blank. What else could he do? He went ahead and did it rather than fill the space with something else. And it was a clever move. But I think the real item of note here is that he did it knowing the consequences, knowing there would be consequences and not knowing the gravity of the extent of what would happen. And that was real courage.
What qualities do you see in Goenka that are especially relevant to journalism today?
Devotion to the public's right to good journalism. We have a saturated media environment with all kinds of things, many good journalists, many good journals, but we also have a lot of journalists that want to preserve access, so they don't say anything, even though they may know something to be true. They hold off so they won't have their access and permission to speak to a senator or the president or somebody important in business curtailed. And that plays into managing your brand, which is corruptive. Goenka had a brand, but that's a better kind of brand. Integrity, that's a better brand.
One of the fascinating things about the story is that it could only happen in print. A blank space in a newspaper is impossible to ignore. Do you think there's an equivalent act of resistance that could be done in digital journalism today, or was something unique about the physical newspaper that made Goenka's protest so effective?
Well, in 1975, print was dominant. There were multiple newspapers, but print was dominant. There was radio and TV, but print was dominant in a way that isn't, where if you did something dramatic, it would be seen by a lot of people and it would carry the weight of that. TikTok is popular, and there are other massively popular venues. There's going to be dozens of things you encounter digitally, media-wise, during your daily diet. There are truth tellers with valid and important messages on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, and their Substacks, or even their Boston Globe or the New York Times. They're valid and important things writing and publishing, but we're swimming in so much stuff. It is diluted. And even when something is important, it's diluted. It's one more potato chip in the bag that you're devouring in front of you. I don't think you could. That's not to say we should bring it back. Everything changes, but I don't think so. Yeah, this was a singular thing.
We certainly don't live in a monoculture anymore. Another aspect of the story was that while you were researching the piece, you ran into conflicting accounts online and you had difficulties, getting AI tools to substantiate some of the details. What was that process like, and what does it say about the current state of historical information on the internet?
Yeah, well, that's a podcast in and of itself. I mean, we all who are trying to write and publish, we're using the tools that we have available to us. And in the digital world, we have come to have, just a remarkable array of things that we can use for research and preparing our work. But the pollution level is growing quite extreme. I think AI is part of this increase in pollution because stories are easily regenerated based on something that was incorrect but published on a blog or even in a journal. I don't want to get into, in this session, some of the conflicting things I found from canonical sources that I then had to dig quite a lot underneath and go to like literally the bookshelf and the library and get away from digital to do some verification. I would caution everybody that it may be easy and you can get a lot of seemingly rich material, but there are a lot of clangers. There's a lot of misstatement of fact. And much of the time, as in the case in this story, it came from accepted sources. Why? We're going to get into that. Newsjunkie is going to take a look at how respected sources are now republishing or initiating the publication of, let's give it a charitable term, just lazy work.
As someone who writes frequently about newspapers and civilization, what did Goenka's story teach you about the relationship between publishers and democracy?
It's more than a utility, the news. It's more than entertainment, a way to distract ourselves. It's part and parcel of democracy. And this story sends that home. In the article, I touch on his courage during the British Raj and the imprisonment of Gandhi and Nehru. He did things that would have had massive consequences. It had massive consequences. It could have had the worst, either imprisonment or death. I mean, while I was researching it, I was put in mind of a visit I made many years ago to Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and we were with the tour guide. It's actually with the Park Service, National Park Service, and we were looking in the glass case of the Declaration of Independence, and the guide asked the question, we all know that these are the founders' signatures. You see their signatures. You see John Hancock, it's this big, Thomas Jefferson, all the founders. Their hand is on the Declaration of Independence. And she said, what would have been the consequences if this meeting where they signed this had been found out by the British, or that the revolution had been stopped? What would have happened? And no one said anything. And I said, well, they would have been arrested and jailed. And she looked at me kind of in silence and looked around the room. They would have been hanged. Goenka didn't know.
Right. Hindsight is 2020. But if I can ask you to speculate a little bit, what do you think Goenka would be if he was alive today and he was running a newspaper? What do you think he would be fighting for or fighting against?
Good question. His character he would have fought the corruption of reality. He wouldn't have tolerated alternative facts, spin. It would have been his meat and potatoes to go after that.
Well, Gordon, if people have not read your article, I would suggest they go to newsjunkie.net and read it. I look forward to your next newspaper and civilizations piece. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Peter.